really interesting. I mean, sadly, the pandemic has had an impact on a lot of young people's lives. But those skills and experiences of, that normal stuff are absolutely constant.
The British royal family has been shaken to its very core. In a deeply emotional and revealing interview, Prince Edward finally opened up about decades of struggles carefully hidden behind the palace walls, exposing for the first time the pain of living in the long shadow of his elder brother. From the relentless pressures of childhood to the subtle yet lasting impact on his adult life, Edward's raw emotional confession has left the entire nation of Britain in stunned silence. As the country grapples with the weight of his revelation,
it's been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that, and it's very, very sad.
One question dominates every conversation: what finally pushed Edward to speak out in this gripping royal drama? Prince Andrew's shocking confession earlier had sent ripples across the kingdom, but Edward's disclosure added a new, intimate layer to the story. In a recent documentary honouring Queen Elizabeth's life and reign, Edward made revelations that sent shockwaves reverberating through the United Kingdom. On the day of the interview, Edward entered the studio, exuding an air of calm composure. He seemed confident on the surface, yet Sophie immediately noticed the subtle tension gripping his posture, the almost imperceptible tightness around his eyes. Reaching for his hand, she offered a quiet reassurance. Edward nodded faintly, grateful, but the unease clung to him like a second skin, impossible to ignore. Cameras rolled, lights flickered, and the crew moved with hushed, almost reverential precision. Though the set had been designed as a celebration of the Queen's decades of service and monumental achievements, Edward carried a far deeper purpose. This wasn't merely a tribute to public triumphs. It was a chance to shed light on the private currents that had silently shaped the royal family behind palace walls. The interview began with the usual questions about the Queen's accomplishments. Edward answered with care, courtesy, and a voice steady enough to hide the storms beneath. But those watching closely could sense the tension building, and soon the conversation turned toward more personal territory, probing the Queen's life beyond the public eye. Edward paused. He drew a deep breath, his gaze drifting as if he were reaching back into memories long buried. Then he revealed something extraordinary, a private conversation he had shared with the Queen near the end of her life. It was intimate, unguarded, a rare moment in which a monarch allowed her family to witness her fears, hopes, and deepest wishes. She had entrusted him with a solemn task: to preserve the emotional bonds between her children, her grandchildren, and the family as a whole. This was no small responsibility. It was a charge to protect not merely the family's public image, but the very heart of their private lives, a role demanding vigilance, patience, and immense courage. As Edward spoke, decades of bottled-up emotions surfaced. He confessed the overwhelming feeling that he had failed in this sacred promise. Tears welled in his eyes, slipping unbidden down his cheeks. He spoke of family fractures, the relentless pressure of royal duty, and wounds that had never been voiced. There was profound regret in his words, an aching longing for the closeness and warmth that once defined the family. He recalled quiet childhood evenings with the Queen, moments filled with stories, wisdom, or simple presence. He remembered observing his siblings under the unblinking gaze of the public, witnessing their triumphs and disappointments while remaining in the shadows himself. A mix of admiration, isolation, and longing coursing through him. His voice faltered at times, carrying the sorrow of decades spent watching relationships bend and sometimes break under invisible pressures. He thought of laughter that might have lightened burdens, conversations that could have bridged distance, honesty that might have healed, but none of it had come to pass. The weight of duty often left little room for vulnerability, and Edward had carried that burden silently for years. Edward's words gradually shifted from reflection to revelation. He suggested that the monarchy may have demanded too much perfection, too much polish. Perhaps it was time to allow humanity to coexist with tradition. The public expected flawless composure, unshakable dignity, and constant restraint, but Edward's confession revealed a different kind of strength: courage in vulnerability, dignity in admitting imperfection, and the value of honesty alongside centuries-old tradition. He shared a vision for the future, quiet, intimate, yet profoundly meaningful. Edward imagined a monarchy where relationships mattered more than appearances, where voices could be heard without fear, and where emotional honesty could coexist with tradition. He admitted he had not fully succeeded yet, but speaking these truths was a step forward, a bridge toward repair, understanding, and the slow rekindling of family warmth as cameras captured every word. Edward paused, breathing in the gravity of the moment, feeling decades of weight lift slightly. Sophie squeezed his hand, offering silent support. The studio remained hushed. His words resonated far beyond those walls, touching viewers who had never imagined seeing a royal so unguarded. When the interview ended, Edward's confession lingered with the nation. He showed that vulnerability was not weakness. Imperfection could coexist with duty, and humanity mattered as much as tradition. For Edward himself, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, a moment of reckoning and clarity that would shape his path and perhaps, over time, influence the family he had vowed to protect. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Edward felt a subtle shift. The confession had not healed all fractures or resolved decades of tension, but it had opened space for truth, dialogue, and connection. He knew the journey ahead was long, that the family's quiet storms still raged behind palace doors. But what challenges did Prince Edward encounter in the royal family? Let's find out Prince Edward's struggle. The royal family has always had its share of troublemakers, yet Prince Edward was never one of them. For decades, he was described as the quietest, most reserved member of the British royal family, the one who stayed in the background, steady and dependable, rarely making waves. But when Edward chose to reveal painful truths about his life, it struck the public like a sudden splash of icy water. For the first time, the world glimpsed the toll recent years had taken on him. He did not dramatize his feelings or stage his struggles. He spoke simply, honestly, and quietly, but that very simplicity made the moment even more powerful. Viewers described it as witnessing a man finally step out of the shadow. Edward had long lived in a shadow, cast by both family expectations and his own sense of duty. The public's reaction was swift. People who had barely noticed him before suddenly saw the sadness that lingered behind his polite smile. Many were shocked and began scouring old footage from state events, family gatherings, and charity visits, seeing him in a new, painfully human light, finally understood as a man carrying decades of unseen emotional weight. When people looked at Edward, they remembered the poised, reserved prince speaking carefully. But now, something had shifted. There was an unmistakable depth of sorrow in his eyes, a raw honesty that revealed just how invisible he had felt for most of his life. His role had always been quiet and supportive, letting other family members weather their storms while he stayed in the background. For years, he was expected to remain calm, composed, steady, and now, seeing even a flicker of tremble in his demeanour, earned the sympathy of an entire nation. Prince Edward, the youngest child, rarely thrust into the spotlight, had followed his brother's path through Gordon Town School and later studied history at Cambridge University. Yet unlike his siblings, Edward had never been at the centre of royal crises. He was the dependable engine running behind the scenes, quietly ensuring the family machine kept turning. He didn't chase headlines, spark scandals, or demand attention. Experts often called him the quiet glue, holding the family together. But beneath that calm exterior, tension and pressure had been quietly building for years. Though Edward continued his royal duties with diligence and energy, insiders noticed subtle changes in his posture and the weight in the way he carried himself. Sources close to him revealed much of this strain came from his deep concern for Queen Elizabeth II. He had watched her endure relentless demands, performing over 15,000 official engagements during her reign, modelling strength that was impossible to ignore. Even in her 90s, she worked tirelessly, embodying a calm, unshakable dedication. Edward, closest to her among her children, sought to follow her example, striving to mirror her steadfastness. But the more he tried, the heavier her example became, pressing down on him like a crown of invisible burdens. When the Queen passed away, Edward quietly vowed to keep the family united, to do whatever small part he could to maintain cohesion. Her death prompted the United Kingdom to observe 10 days of mourning, during which nearly 250,000 people queued to pay their respects at her lying in state. Edward felt the weight of duty, but each month that passed made him increasingly aware of the cost of his promise. Something precious was slipping away, and he felt powerless to stop it. Adding to the strain, the unity the Queen had cultivated for decades began to unravel quickly. At first, the changes were subtle. Fewer family photographs, fewer joint appearances, and communication across branches of the family became sporadic. Insiders confirmed that the warmth which once filled a room when the Queen entered had vanished. Disagreements felt larger, tensions stretched wider, and even minor conflicts carried a disproportionate weight. Edward watched as tensions flared between Charles, William, Harry, and himself. What had once been manageable disagreements now carried serious consequences. Debates about the monarchy's future only compounded the pressure. The prince, long regarded as quiet and dependable, now faced the triple burden of family expectations, public scrutiny, and the hidden toll of a lifetime of self-restraint. The rift between William and Harry continued to echo around the world, with surveys showing declining public faith in their bond. But Edward faced his own struggles, private battles that affected both the family's image and the emotional fabric of the household. King Charles confronted his own challenges, attempting to guide the monarchy in a time of fewer active royals and growing demands for openness. Each man weathered his own storm, and Edward silently bore witness, absorbing the tension with quiet resilience. He did not argue, did not choose sides. He simply carried the weight inward. Day after day, doors closed more often, arrivals were timed with precision, and conversations inside the palace became carefully controlled. The home that once felt alive now resembled a museum. Everyone moved cautiously, afraid to disturb the fragile quiet. It was not the public scandals that hurt Edward most. It was the private atmosphere, the distance that could not be bridged, the silences between people that cut deepest. He moved through rooms where echoes of laughter lingered, yet the present felt tense, fragile. Portraits of the Queen offered both comfort and pressure. Her calmness, her steadiness, the way she drew people together haunting him, making him wonder why he could not do the same. That persistent, unspoken question became the seed of his slow breaking point. The more he tried to meet impossible expectations, the closer he edged to the limits of his patience and endurance. It was not a sudden collapse, explosive and dramatic. It was a gradual internal shift, almost invisible from the outside. Most people did not see that Edward's struggle was not a single moment. It had been quietly building for decades. So what was growing up like for Prince Edward, born into royal blood? Let's take a closer look at his childhood and upbringing. From the start, Edward was the quietest child in the royal household. Charles, the heir, naturally drew every eye, destined for the throne. Princess Anne moved with confidence that filled every room she entered. Edward, however, drew attention differently. Without effort, without noise, without claiming space. From a young age, he realized he was different. He didn't compete, didn't push forward. Instead, he stepped back, observing, listening, letting the world swirl around him while he absorbed every detail. People often mistook his quietness for shyness, but it was deeper, a sensitivity he had never learned to hide. Edward noticed what others overlooked, the subtle tension in a posture, the exhaustion in staff after long, grueling days, or the weight his mother carried while balancing her crown and concealing her strain. He sensed moods, heard silences, and remembered tiny details others would forget. These habits quietly shaped him, directing him toward observation and reflection. His closeness with Queen Elizabeth grew naturally from this sensitivity. She recognized his difference, even in silence. He felt comforted by her presence, the palace lighter and safer whenever he was near her. During an interview, Edward revealed that the Queen once told him she knew he saw the world differently. Her words were meant to encourage him, but even as a child, Edward sensed that this gift, the ability to perceive deeply, could be both a blessing and a burden as he grew older. Edward began wrestling with his place within the royal hierarchy. The order was clear. Charles was the future. Anne had built a strong identity of her own, and Edward often felt like an extra piece in a set that already looked complete. He did not want to compete. He only wanted to carve a path that fit his quiet nature, a path that matched the way he perceived the world. But defining that path proved far harder than anyone imagined. His struggles were never flashy or dramatic. They were subtle, persistent, and constant. In his early 20s, he joined the Royal Marines, only to leave training after 4 months. Newspapers were merciless, mocking him for lacking stamina and questioning his toughness, adding public embarrassment to private frustration. the media scrutiny didn't end there. A few years later, Edward ventured into television production with a company called Ardent. Critics pounced on every misstep, highlighting that his programs rarely achieved high ratings, even emphasizing a minor incident filming near Prince William at university. Each criticism, each headline, slowly chipped away at his confidence and sense of self-worth. Contrary to palace guidance, every mistake was magnified simply because of who he was. Each headline chipped away at his confidence, reinforcing a quiet sense of invisibility. Then came Sophie, and everything began to shift. Meeting her changed Edward's life in ways he had never anticipated. She understood his gentleness and gave him a sense of emotional safety he had rarely experienced. Unlike the wider world, she did not see him as background. She saw him as a man deserving space, respect, and care. Her presence became a shield, protecting him from both the glare of the public and the weight of palace expectations. Their wedding in 1999 was watched by over 200 million people worldwide, yet Edward felt grounded because Sophie stood beside him. For the first time, he had someone who could truly see him, someone who could hold him in a way the public never could. With Sophie, Edward finally found balance. They built a life together where he could be the version of himself he genuinely liked. Quietly, they supported charities and meaningful causes, making impactful changes far from the glare of public attention. Observers, even his siblings, noticed how relaxed and at ease he had become around her. The softer, gentler sides of Edward finally had space to breathe, yet comparisons never ceased. Charles continued his public duties, performing over 500 engagements across several years, maintaining the image of a tireless heir. Edward, meanwhile, remained under constant scrutiny long before the family faced its most serious controversies. He carried out his work quietly, hoping one day the world would recognize that even the quieter members of the royal family had crucial roles. His insecurities never dominated him, but they surfaced when cameras drew too close or critics measured him against his siblings. Then came the loss that shook him deeply: the death of Queen Elizabeth. According to close sources, her passing reopened all the insecurities Edward had carried since childhood. She had been the one person who understood his softness as a strength rather than a flaw. Losing her felt like losing the anchor that had kept him steady for decades. The funeral was watched by more than 4 billion people worldwide, a staggering testament to her reach and influence. For Edward, the experience was overwhelming. Standing beside grieving siblings, his sorrow was as much about his own identity as it was about love for her. The palace felt different without her presence. He felt exposed, the emotional weight of monarchy pressing down harder than ever. The responsibilities that had once seemed manageable now seemed crushing, and Edward struggled to find a moment of reprieve. This time, he could no longer push it aside. It was not anger or fear, just relentless pressure. And that pressure reached a breaking point during a recent family meeting, forcing Edward to confront the long-buried struggles and doubts that had quietly shaped his entire life. So why did Edward confront King Charles? Let's dive into Prince Edward's recent face-off with the king. King Charles had called the royal family together for a meeting. No ceremony, no public fanfare, just a quiet, closed-door gathering. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and worn carpet, the kind of scent that always reminded Edward of long, silent hours, wandering palace corridors as a child, observing the world around him in careful, quiet study. The tension was almost tangible. Public concern about the monarchy had been growing for months, and projecting unity had never felt so crucial. Beneath the surface, frustration simmered. Edward felt its weight even before the meeting began. When King Charles spoke, he did so with careful calm, each word measured and deliberate. He emphasized unity, discipline, and the need to guard the family's image against even the smallest misstep that could become public. The message was clear. Appearances mattered more than anything. When Prince William spoke, he repeated the same themes: control, perfection, restraint. Edward listened closely, noting just how deeply the family had been trained to value optics over honesty, appearance over peace. Every sentence reminded him of a system built to prioritize image above human connection. The discussion stretched on for hours, each word reinforcing the invisible chains of expectation that had shadowed him for decades. Prince Harry was absent. No one mentioned it, yet Edward could feel the empty space he left. a silent presence that everyone knew. He also saw the worry etched into King Charles's face. Each remark about family unity felt hollow, a carefully constructed mask, stirring a deep, gnawing unease inside Edward that he could no longer ignore. Then came the moment that finally cracked Edward's carefully held calm. King Charles spoke in his usual measured tone, stating plainly that some royal relationships were beyond repair. The words hit Edward like a physical blow, reverberating deep inside him. The air's shift in posture mirrored an internal tremor. Something inside Edward stirred, too. For years, he had been the quiet observer, weathering his own inner storms and private frustrations. But this moment felt different. This was no ordinary tension. This was a declaration from the head of the family, a statement that certain connections were no longer worth protecting or nurturing. In that instant, Edward felt an urgent, almost electric need to respond. And what he did next stunned the royal family, leaving everyone in that room utterly shocked and silent, hearts pounding as the gravity of the moment sank in. Silence hung thick. What impact did Edward's statement have? Let's explore Edward's moment of raw emotional honesty. Prince Edward had always carried a quiet, observant nature, watching the world turn around him while keeping his own thoughts tucked carefully away. But on that day, something inside him shifted, erupting into a rare and powerful moment of courage. He chose to speak with emotional honesty, naming feelings that had long been ignored or hidden. He spoke of the necessity of acknowledging emotions rather than burying them beneath a mask of perfection. Edward called attention to the family's deep, sometimes relentless obsession with appearances, pointing out that their constant concern for public perception often came at the expense of real human connection, warmth, and trust. For the first time, Edward openly challenged the family. He confronted rigid structures, unspoken rules, and the emotional coldness that had quietly governed their interactions for decades. His words were calm, measured, but they carried a weight that shook the room instantly. Those present felt it immediately. King Charles, accustomed to guiding every discussion, blinked rapidly, eyes wide in surprise. Prince William, always composed and in control, shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that the usual order had been disrupted. Camilla, the Duchess, glanced downward, caught between courtesy and discomfort, unsure how to respond to what many would see as a breach of protocol. Edward's speech did not stop there. He spoke of the hidden, private toll of life inside palace walls, the burden of maintaining flawless behavior while carrying heavy emotional pain. He recalled moments of watching the family fracture silently, moments when he had longed for warmth, understanding, and human connection that always seemed just out of reach. His words were confessions, not accusations, a raw expression of the truth he had carried for so long. As he finished, Edward saw the impact etched on every face in the room. Even King Charles, normally commanding attention effortlessly, seemed momentarily unmoored. William, the picture of composure, could only stare, stunned. Camilla, caught in the turbulence, looked away, remaining tense. Edward had not intended to shock them so profoundly. He sought not to hurt, but to speak truths that could no longer remain hidden. Yet the truth, once voiced, has a way of breaking the quiet, and now everyone felt the weight of it pressing down, heavy, undeniable, demanding acknowledgement. Edward quietly left the room, wandering through palace corridors as his own words echoed in his mind. Staff moved silently around him, unaware as he replayed the courage, tension, and vulnerability of having spoken honestly in a place where truth often remained muted. A mixture of liberation and fear surged through him. Speaking had lightened the burden in his heart, but it also revealed cracks in the family, in himself, and in the carefully constructed walls of tradition that surrounded them. As he wandered, Edward's eyes fell upon a quiet, almost hidden room. On a polished wooden desk lay a letter that felt immediately familiar. The thick paper, deliberate handwriting, unmistakably the Queen's. He had seen her letters many times before, always formal, always dignified. But this one was different, brimming with personal warmth and insight. Edward carefully unfolded the paper. Each word seemed to carry her presence, her gentle yet firm voice reminding him of something essential. She wrote about the importance of protecting the heart of the family, nurturing unity not merely for appearances, but through real emotional connection. She reminded him that true strength was measured not by perfection or composure alone, but by empathy, understanding, and the courage to act and speak honestly, especially when it was hardest. Reading her words, Edward felt warmth and quiet reassurance. The Queen had entrusted him with something vital, the responsibility of keeping the family emotionally intact. She acknowledged the complexities, fractures, and distance that had grown among his siblings. She encouraged him to be a bridge, a steady and empathetic presence where others had become rigid or withdrawn. Edward paused, absorbing the weight of her message. He realized that the challenge he had posed to the family that day, the words he had risked speaking aloud, was only the beginning. Protecting the family's heart would not be a one-time act. It would require constant effort, patience, resilience, and courage every single day, in every interaction, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. It would demand that he speak, listen, nurture, and endure the discomfort of confronting difficult truths. And now, Edward understood that this path, though challenging, was necessary for the family and for himself. So what are your thoughts on Prince Edward's emotional confession to the entire nation of Britain? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story so everyone can witness the courage it takes to speak the truth.